that he lived through the great Halloween blizzard of 1994, which 91, which marks him as older than me and also a true Minnesotan. That's the dividing line. Although if you drive on a lake, you also can get your Minnesota card stamped. And then he did his residency at Cincinnati and fellowship at Dana-Farber in Boston, where he stayed on as an instructor for a couple of years, as well as a clinical informatics fellow at MIT. And Sam has made an incredible name for himself in the last 10 years as the guy who is aggregating pediatric cancer data and now many other pediatric phenotypes, and he'll describe sociome data. How many of you remember Star Trek: The Next Generation? Anybody? Yep, there we go. So, you know, Worf and Data, but also they invented a new villain for Star Trek, the Borg, whose goal it was to assimilate everything. So I think of Sam as sort of the Volchenboum, who's assimilating all the data in pediatric cancer with relentless logic. These are rare diseases. There is no point in having different data gardens. It all needs to be, aggregated and made available to the research public so that we can get to cures and better outcomes faster. So with that, I introduce Dr. Sam Volchenboum.
Great, thanks, Logan. So before I get started, I just want to say that this link is at the bottom of almost every slide, and it goes right to download of the slides, and you're welcome to download them. You don't have to copy it down because it's on every slide. You can share them, do whatever you want with them. There's a lot of links in the slides. I did complain to my partner a bit last night. I said, it's very strange going out to dinner with somebody who has an even drier sense of humor than I do. Because usually people are asking me if I'm the one, are you serious? And so to go out with Logan is a real exercise in who can be more dry and underspoken. So really happy to be here today. We have way too much material to get through, so I'm gonna jump right in. I'm gonna go fast. If anything you want to ask about in the middle, please shoot your hand up or just start talking. Happy to entertain questions as we go. So I'm going to just obviously talk about the motivation for studying rare diseases. Going to spend most of the time talking about our work and data for the common good. I'm going to try to get you excited about next generation data collection and our vision for long-term follow-up and survivorship. And if we have time, I'll jump into a little bit about our sociome data commons that we're working on. So this has always been our motivation. We have this perfect storm of siloed data, rare diseases, difficult questions. And if you think about it, we've created this academic system in the US and all over the world that really rewards hoarding data. You get rewarded for siloing data, for keeping it yourself, for writing grants and papers yourself and not sharing. And that really obviously has to change. Pediatric cancer, one of the great success stories of the last 60, 70 years. You walked into the office in 1960 with ALL, pretty much got some steroids and got sent home, and nobody survived. And now 95+% of those kids will survive, often with very little long-term effects. For most of our cancers, we've seen steady improvements, but of course, even with some of the metastatic solid tumors and with some of the more difficult to treat leukemias, we have a long way to go when it comes to survival, and certainly with late effects and adverse events. I'm only going to have this on one slide, this kind of information, but keep in mind that globally, about half of the kids who die of cancer are never given a diagnosis of cancer. And so I think as we think about our care in the US and what we're able to achieve here, we have to realize that in most parts of the world, they don't have the most rudimentary forms of even data collection to follow these kids. And so the kinds of things we're hoping to develop, I think, can be expanded and used for data collection in other parts of the world. So why have pediatric cancer survival rates improved so much? It's because of all the great new drugs we've developed over the last 30 years. No, of course not. We're still using a lot of the same chemotherapy, although we're now starting to see, of course, new medications that are going to be important. Early detection surveillance is also not unlike adult cancers. It doesn't seem to be, if you catch if you catch a tumor 3 weeks later or a month later, does not seem to be really that helpful. And we have tried early detection schemes for different types of cancers, and they've not proven to be helpful. But it's really been cooperative group trials. It's been our ability to collect data around the world, around the country, and bring it together to study it that's allowed us to increase the cure rates of pediatric cancer so dramatically, along, of course, with better understanding of risk stratification and tumor biology and genomics, better supportive care and things like that. But I think for me, the motivation has really been, it's been bringing together, my beautiful slide about bringing together the data is right here. It's been bringing lots of data together, which has led to our ability to improve. Yes, this is my slide in the winter. So data for the common good was formed really to try to maximize how we use data, how to drive our discoveries for human health, collecting large amounts of data. And you'll notice this is a disease agnostic mission statement. So we want to make sure that the techniques and what we're doing can be applied across any number of diseases. We want to make sure that data remain accessible and usable. We want to make it easy for people to do the right thing with the data. We don't want to make it confusing about governance and legal issues. We want to make all that boilerplate so that people can come in and just start using the data to study. So we're founded on these principles of building community and then ultimately having impact in how data are used. This is what our pediatric cancer data commons looks like. These are our individual consortia. When I first thought about the pediatric cancer data commons, I thought we would just have one giant commons. And then I found out that even within the children's oncology group, people do not work that well together across disease areas. So what we ended up having to do, and I think in retrospect, it was the right thing to do, is have each group come to the table independently, develop their own scientific questions. And then what we've been doing is incepting common governance, common data elements for these groups while they're all developing their own data dictionaries. We have a single team that works on how to develop these things commonly over the groups. So this has continued to grow. We've added in many tumor types. You'll see conspicuously absent is Wilms tumor, which we're hoping to launch in the next year. But for most other pediatric cancer types, including cancer predisposition syndromes, we have emerging or mature data commons. So data for the common good includes this big collection of pediatric cancer data commons, as well as our clinical trials matching platform, which I'll talk about. But recently, in the last 2-3 years, we have had a lot of influx of other groups that are interested in building data commons. So we're working with Chan Zuckerberg on monogenic epilepsies. We're working with Crohn's disease with an international group, working on Chicago area gun violence, working on diabetes. And we found that the same techniques that we've used across pediatric cancer are certainly easy to use across many of these other diseases, where it's really about building community and building better ways to collect and share data. So I believe in having a big tent. And what often happens is we'll go to somebody and say, listen, we want to build, the diabetes story is a good one. We wanted to build a monogenic diabetes data commons. And the PI said, well, we're just going to have to build it at U Chicago. We have a collection here, and everybody else who works on this is either not very nice or is not going to want to work together or already thinks they're doing it. And to me, that's a call to action. So what I said to this person is, let's have a meeting and we're going to invite everybody. So we've had several meetings. This is over the past 2 years now. We now have 13 groups signed on to be part of the monogenic diabetes data commons. And these are the same groups that we thought weren't going to come with us because they didn't want to work together or because they thought that it was too competitive. And so for us, it's really about engaging cooperative groups, patient registries, pharma companies, academic medical centers, whoever we can get to the table. And it's not about like, give us your data. It's about give us your knowledge. Come with us on this journey to develop a community around data standards, around sharing data. And eventually, a lot of groups want to share their data, but it's not a necessary component to be part of the initiative. We spend a lot of time thinking about data dictionaries. And this is not like exciting and sexy, but this is really the heart of what we do. When people are left to their own devices to build data collection tools, they will do whatever they want. They'll build forms in REDCap or some other platform where they'll tag male and female with 0 or 1 or M or F. And what this leads to is a lot of confusion when you try to combine data from different sources. And this is a very simple example. And imagine how complex this can get over many different types of data. So what we do is we sit down with the group and we say, all right, with our US and European, Japanese, Australian, whoever we can get to the table, we say, what is our, in this case, for biologic sex, what are our standards going to be? And we come up with a list. In this case, it was male, female, and unknown. And then what we do is all those elements are bound to codes that are in some sort of controlled data terminology. And now all of a sudden, you no longer have ambiguity, because if you have this code, you can look it up on the website. This is at the NCI, but there's many other common data repositories like this. And now you have a description of the term male, and it's unambiguous now, and you can build your form to pull that in automatically. Looking at a much more complicated example, this is from our leukemia dictionary, reasons for somebody to come off of therapy. Imagine what it was like getting the group together from the US, from Europe, from other parts of the world, and to say, we're gonna come up with a single list that we all agree on are the reasons that somebody might come off therapy from a trial. So we did this, we worked together to build the list, and of course, these are all then gonna be bound to these common elements so that there's no more ambiguity. You might write completion of planned therapy, but in the dictionary, it might say end of planned treatment. Those are the same things, and they come from the same code. Now, all of a sudden, you have a coded list of variables and acceptable values, and you can even do things like localized data collection, because if you have a set of terms behind it, you can build a translational layer that will allow you to build a form in any language you want now, because you have the codes underneath it. These data dictionary meetings are really important. They're intense. They take a lot of involvement. We had a meeting when we first started with sarcoma where we actually had a 20-minute discussion about whether cheek was part of face or head and neck. And we actually sat there and debated with the Europeans and the US to come up with this. I can't remember what we decided, but we came up with a solution to that. That's the kind of work that in the end helps you build a stable data dictionary. So we've done this now over all these different pediatric cancer types. We've established data dictionaries for many of them. We have many contributors that are committed to putting data in. These consortia are all consortia that we've either helped start or that we help run. You have to have a cute name for your consortium that stands for something that makes life easier. We have tens of thousands of patients in the Commons now with lots of studies ongoing. These data dictionaries are all available. They're all on our website. They're open source. We want people to download them and use them. They come with a Creative Commons license. They're all highly annotated with how they were built, who built them, what the dates were, what the change log is. All of that is built in. And we want people to use the data dictionaries, and this list continues to grow. And if anybody's interested in the exciting world of ontologies and things like that, I'm happy to get folks hooked up with our group. So governance, of course, is a major issue for us. We work with groups all over the world. We put in data sharing agreements with 40 different countries now. It's been actually not that difficult to share clinical data. People keep telling me it's impossible, and yet we keep sharing clinical data with GDPR and HIPAA and UK data protection. I actually was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago in Denmark, and somebody in the audience said, well, it's impossible to share clinical data with GDPR. And I said, well, we have it. And he goes, no, you don't, because it's impossible. So we actually had like an argument sitting there where he said, you don't have the data. Well, we do. We have lots of data from Italy, Germany, France, Australia, Japan, and we continue to add more data. We just signed a data sharing agreement with Egypt Children's, and we're going to start to share data, and we're going out in February to Tata Medical Center in India to put data sharing agreements in place there. Now, sharing genomics, full genomics, and sharing biosample data is a challenge. We have not been able to successfully do that across with our European colleagues, but I also think that there's going to be a path for that coming as well. So the way we have our governance set up, this is important in that the individual consortia can act independently, and we act as service providers. So we see ourselves as like a neutral convener of the data. And that allows us a lot of leeway, because if you're putting your sarcoma data in, you don't have to worry about us scooping you with a sarcoma paper. We're not interested in writing individual cancer papers. We're interested in writing papers on how to build data commons. So this has allowed us, I think, a bit of flexibility and trust, because people put their data with us. They know that we're not going to use it to scoop them on their research. And then we've launched 4 international advisory committees: a scientific advisory council, external advisory board, an adolescent and young adult research council to look at AYA data, as well as most recently a lived experience advisory panel, which is going to be made up of parents and advocates and patients. That's going to help us understand on the international level issues around data aggregation and sharing. And if anybody themselves wants to or knows somebody who might want to be involved in some of our advocacy or governance committees, just let me know. We'd love to have more involvement. Okay, so what does all this let us do? We have a cohort discovery portal. Again, this is open to the public. Anybody can log in. You can go in, you can select, in this case, looking at AML data with our Interact consortium. You can then break it down by cooperative group that put the data in. These are both US and European and Japanese cooperative groups. Also, our friends in Memphis are up here. So we've got data from St. Jude as well. And you can also sort by clinical trial. And you can do a faceted search over any of the data elements for that particular tumor. And the other thing you can do for the first time now is actually do research across these different tumor types because they're all harmonized to the same standard. And as this list continues to grow, you'll be able to do more cross-disease research. And again, open to the public, anybody can log in and use the portal. The discovery portal allows you to do these faceted searches and then save them. You can share your searches with your colleagues, and then you can actually do some in-browser analytics. When I first showed this at a meeting that had a bunch of statisticians, they all got very upset. They said that this was going to be the end of the work they were able to do because of all the p-hacking and all of the hypothesis generation that people were going to do. So we actually had to spend an entire year doing mitigation of their concerns. So now if you want to use the graphical analysis, by the way, this kind of tool is present on a lot of platforms, but we were held to a very high standard. So now to use this platform, you have to sign away a whole bunch of stuff. They actually thought somebody was going to do this and then take a screenshot and put it into a paper. So we've had to go through a lot of hoops, but it's there, it's working. You can do hypothesis testing. Apparently, the way my devs have set it up, if you try to do 100 different graphs, some alarm will go off and you'll get ejected or something. But there are protections in place to try to protect the data. In terms of impact, obviously impact is changing the care of kids with cancer and making less morbidity and mortality. The surrogate we have for impact at this point is really around publications and projects. But as we continue to grow, I would hope that we would measure our impact more in terms of changing the practice of pediatric cancer. We do have some very detailed research pages here where you can go and see all the projects that are in progress, all the data that have been requested, the investigators, who's working on what. That is completely transparent and open. I want to talk a little bit about our clinical trials matching tool, Gearbox. So we've all, or hopefully, or some of us have seen this problem. You have a kid who has relapsed cancer, and you don't really have anything for them at that moment. And so what we often have to do for these kids is put them on some sort of holding chemotherapy to wait for a couple weeks or a couple months until we find a clinical trial. So Leukemia and Lymphoma Society asked us to help solve this problem, and they had us build a tool that we're calling Gearbox, which is about trying to find a clinical trial for a kid within 3 or 4 days. And the issue is this, clinical trials, I'm not sure if you all know this, are written in Microsoft Word for the most part. They're not standardized. They're full of abbreviations that are not standard. So parsing through a clinical trial, trying to understand the inclusion-exclusion criteria is very difficult for practitioners, let alone parents trying to figure this out. So we realized this was a huge problem, finding trials for your patients. And so we tried to come up with an automated way to do this. Now, there are plenty of tools on the market that work for pharma companies to help mine your electronic health record to find patients for a trial. What we have not seen done well is if you're a patient, how do you find a trial for you? So a patient-centric clinical trials matching platform. So we built Gearbox, which allows clinicians and parents to log in to get to a list of trials that are based on rules extraction that we have built both through manual extraction as well as automated means. And it looks like this. It's open to the public. Anybody can go here. There is no gate. And once you are on the site, you see a list of trials that are potentially match, that are all pulled from clinicaltrials.gov, and this list continues to grow. And then on the left, you can start to put in what you know about the patient, or the patient can put in about themselves. And as you enter in criteria for the patient, these trials will match to match versus potentially match versus non-match. For each trial, you can dig in, figure out how to get more information, who the PI is, what the website is. And then behind the scenes, you can also look at the Boolean logic, which allows you to see exactly why a particular patient is matching or non-matching, which can be really helpful if somebody is not matching for a criteria that could change or something that could be variable. So we've had a lot of uptake and use of this platform. We're expanding out. We have funding now to build it out across all pediatric cancers, and now we've actually seen interest from other non-cancer communities interested in trying to use this tool as well. We don't want to just stop there. What we're hoping to do is actually pull in data automatically from the electronic health record to pre-populate some of the values so that the The clinician's not looking for the latest bilirubin, that we can pull that stuff in. And more importantly, we're hoping to pull in data from groups like Hematologics, Tempus, Foundation Medicine, COG. They actually pre-populate some of the data. Now that's going to necessitate, of course, having a login site and trying to make sure that we understand the providers using it. But we think that ultimately we can build a platform that's really going to help drive the use of clinical trials for kids with cancer. Okay, so I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about what we think is coming down the line for better data collection, because everything I've showed you so far are data that have been abstracted from clinical trials, which, clinical trials is a person doing, we call it swivel chair technology, right? Where you're in Epic and then you're typing into a form. And we want to try to do away with that kind of manual data collection. So one of the things you could leverage is this bulk transfer using this technology called HL7 FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, which is a standard for pulling data out of electronic health records. HHS has mandated the use of HL7 FHIR, that hospitals must conform to a certain spec. The problem with this is that every hospital has sort of their own individual way of hooking up to this. And from my perspective, I think a problem is that the FHIR spec is not as deep as we would like it. It's not as easy to get as detailed data as we would need for pediatric cancer. We wrote a paper on using an intermediary called, which is a REDCap connector that allows us to have data come out of the EHR through REDCap into a data collection form. We did this using a set of patients from neuroblastoma studies so we could compare, and we saw a very high correlation with the data that we could pull out with what had been manually abstracted for these patients. So we think that this is one way among many of pulling data out of an electronic health record. Now there's this manual way, which a lot of groups use, which is where you go to the patient and you get their consent. And then with the patient's consent, you actually mine the health record and you then manually extract all the information. Citizen Health has been doing this at scale with epilepsy and other diseases. We were talking to our oncology group this morning, and they do a lot of manual abstraction from electronic health records like this. This is costly and slow, but the data you get are extremely high quality because you have a person reading a note to figure out exactly what's in there. And we have not yet perfected that from an automated way of pulling data out. So this is a great way to get data out, but it's slow and very costly. This is what I think the future is. It's using an individual API transfer. And to do this, you're basically asking the patient for permission to mine their medical record on their behalf. So let's talk about that for a few minutes. What is an API? So an API, I'm glad you asked. API is an application programming interface. And so an API works like this. So when you go to search for a flight, there's not like a person behind the scenes who's doing that search at United Airlines and American. These guys have all set up APIs. And what an API is, this interface means that they all use the same standard. So when I say, show me all the flights from O'Hare to Seattle on this date, there's a standardized way to do that. And each of these sites can react to that and send the data back. And so every aggregator you go to is using these APIs, and it only works because the industry has decided on a standard. Now, old people like me remember that when ATMs first came out, you had to go to an ATM for your bank. If you went to the Chase ATM and you had your account somewhere else, you couldn't get money out. Now you can go to any ATM in the world, put your card in, and get money out. Why is that? Because they all decided on the same standard and API to transact banking data. If healthcare would do that, we would go a long way. So healthcare is starting to do that with this HL7 FHIR messaging. And if you have an iPhone and you use the health app on there, you can connect to the Epic API the same way that you go through your MyChart. It connects to Epic or Cerner through the API and sucks your data out and either sends it to your phone, sends it to MyChart. And that API is based on a set of standards that we can query. And if the patient gives consent for doing that to us, we can do that on their behalf. And so this is what our next generation of data collection looks like. It's going to be collecting data through the API. This is from my data that I sucked in from UChicago. And it's going to be taking those data, asking patients for permission, taking those data, developing a secure connection, and then having those end up in a data commons. And to us, I think this is where we're super excited now. It's to leverage this to collect data at scale from patients at a very granular level. So the way we think it will look like is that we'll use the patient access API to put data into a database. We'll run a set of scripts to handle all the medication data and lab data. And of course, the real interesting data are in these free text notes. that the residents love to copy and paste from one day to the next. And so we need to get into the free text notes, whether those are pathology reports, surgery notes, resident notes. And so we'll have a manual extraction and natural language processing and automated, hopefully large language model pipeline to help pull data out of free text notes that could end up then in the database. I think this is what we're really going to put a lot of, I know this is where we're going to put a lot of effort into over the next couple of years, because this is going to allow us to get at the full electronic health record for a patient. So one of the ways we're using this is in thinking about long-term follow-up or survivorship. So I told you a lot about the Pediatric Cancer Data Commons. We're working on predisposition syndromes like Fanconi, and we have a predisposition commons. But we're really excited now to do survivorship, late effects, and thinking about how do we get the data for kids as they graduate and move on with their lives. One way to think about the problem with survivorship is to look at the number of excess deaths per year from cancer within the first 5 years, and that's gone down because we've had better survivorship overall, and that holds with leukemia. So in the blue is within 5 years. And even if we look out over 5 to 10 years or greater than 10 years, we do see the number of expected deaths falling over time, meaning that we're getting better at treating kids with leukemia and their late effects. But if you look at other diseases like Hodgkin or brain tumors, we're basically just punting the ball down the field, right? We're trading off this increase in survival that we've seen. So the blue is getting thinner, but the number of problems and deaths we're seeing after 10 years is growing. So we're not doing well with some of these kids when it comes to survivorship and late effects. So they get out 10 years, they get a secondary cancer, or they have heart problems, they have lung problems, and we're not doing a great job of figuring out how to take care of them. And what happens? I think this all makes sense to me. You finish your therapy, you go off to college, you get a job, you get married. The last thing you're thinking about is the cancer that you had when you were 5 years old, right? So you could have all sorts of questions, you know? Everything from simple as, should I get a flu shot, to do I need to have an early mammogram? And what resources does a 25-year-old have to answer these questions, if they even think to ask the questions? I mean, I think about myself as a recent college grad. The last thing I would be thinking about is follow-up from something that happened to me when I was a kid. Now, obviously, a lot of these parents are still going to be involved, but for a lot of kids, their parents aren't involved in their care anymore. So what happens now? A kid finishes up their cancer therapy, and we often just take data, we print it out, we hand them a dossier, a folder, we give it to them, the parents have to go home, figure out where to put it. And then, you know, when the kid goes on with their life and they're seeing a doctor later on, they really have no idea what happened to all their information. This is starting to improve with things like Passport for Care and SurvivorLink. We're at a point now where data can end up in standardized forms. They're still manually abstracted, again, with the swivel chair thing, but the data are at least ending up in some sort of system that can be queried. But again, a lot of times for the family, they're left with either a card or some sort of manually extracted data, which makes it very hard to ping. So we think we can do better than this. We think there's a better way. It's even made worse if the kid has repeated follow-up visits, or worse, they're seen at multiple institutions. Now, how do we combine data? If the kid went to CHOP for some of their care and they came back here, how do we combine their data? This is not an easily solved problem. So we think we can do better. And so our vision is this. Our vision is that anytime a child is seen at multiple sites, we can use those technologies that I showed you before to pull their data in from multiple sites and to put it into a single repository. We can combine their data from multiple centers using the patient's own permission to build a long-term follow-up registry. We should stop thinking about the data as being locked up. Doug loves this slide, by the way. We should stop thinking about the data being locked up, right? We can get the data out now. The data do not belong to Epic. The data belong to the patient. And we've spent too many years pretending like the data need to be in this ivory tower when it really needs to be in the hands of the patients. We have to figure out how to disambiguate. Patients going to have different identifiers at these institutions, and we have to figure out how to make sure we have the same John Smith at each place, and we know how to do that. We can honest broker that and figure out how to disambiguate the patients. We have to have cloud-based consent. I'm sort of sick of people talking about electronic consent, which is basically like a PDF that somebody puts through a fax machine that somebody signed. That's not electronic consent. To me, electronic consent is you have a system where you can see who's agreed to what and under what conditions, and you have a system that you can query that's computable. So we have a long way to go there. And then we can have a code that the patient and parents can have that basically is a link back to their data. As the patient grows up, we have to reconsent them when they turn 18. as they have their life and their wearables and all the other data that they can collect, and they have surveys, we can hopefully go back to them and get information and add that to the registry. And ultimately, those data can end up in a de-identified research commons that we want to help run. But here's the real payoff, is when this patient goes to see their doctor, they say, here's a barcode, here's what happened to me. And the doctor, who probably doesn't really know, can also go and figure out through the same resources exactly what the patient needs at this point. So this is what we're funded to do now. This is what we're working on, trying to figure out how do you engage young adults, and then how do you figure out how to collect data and make it available to them later on. It was very important for us not to reinvent anything. That's the study that we're going to do next. Again, you got to have a cute acronym for your study. So we did not want to reinvent anything. So Passport for Care has 40,000 kids or more, and they're collecting data on kids once they graduate and move on. Anything we build will feed any of these other systems through an API that we're going to make available for the data that we collect. I think the future of healthcare data collection is going to look a lot like this, where you have patients that control their own data through a front-end interface on your phone. You'll be able to control how your data are. Those data will be collected from multiple EHRs, and you'll be able to decide, hey, I want my data from this hospital and this hospital made available. It'll all be through checkboxes and clicks on your phone. And those data can all get processed and used for many downstream applications and apps. Apple's leading the way on this, but I don't think it's very fair to leverage a technology that less than half of the people in the world can use. So I think we need to think about ways to democratize this beyond your Apple mHealth app to any types of apps that we can develop. We talked a bit about the medical records up there. That's the one we're talking about with patient provided, but we can't forget about the patient reported outcome surveys, electronic health records through bulk engagement, research studies we talked a little bit about. And then I think this micro engagement is key. How do we take a 22-year-old who's at college and get them to care about their healthcare? So is that text messaging? Is it, we were talking at breakfast this morning, none of the four of us knew anything about what a 25-year-old would want to see. They're not going to Facebook for their information. So how do you do this on the platforms that are currently available to young people? Okay, so I left time. We're going to talk about the Sociome Data Commons for a few minutes. I am switching gears because I want to talk about what we're doing with our CTSA, our Clinical and Translational Science Award, because this is another example, I think, of how we're trying to democratize data. This is through what we have as called an ITM, our Institute for Translational Medicine, which is a multi-hospital group in Chicago. And I'm running this project called our Sociome Data Commons. And we're trying, I'm sure many of you have seen this picture before. What we're trying to do is think about the links to structural racism and how we can move up proximal in this, on this spectrum. We spend all our time in medical school and at hospitals working here. How do you take sick people and try to make them better? Maybe a little preventive medicine about things like quitting smoking and things like good nutrition, but we really need to work up here. You know, how do we figure out if somebody has too much mold in their house, and what does that mean? Or do they have too much mold because there's too much flooding, right? So these are the problems that we need to try to figure out how to solve. So what we think about is the sociome, which is really the lived experience that somebody has. It's all your social determinants of health plus lots of other things. If somebody's Fitbit shows that they took 10,000 steps, is that because they're filling in potholes or because they're teaching a yoga class? I think it's important to try to figure out what somebody's environment is like. Do they live in a home where there's lots of love? Or do they live in a home that's very stressful? If somebody lives on the south side of Chicago, are they exposed to a lot of pollution from steel mills versus if they live on the north side and there's less pollution? These are the problems that we're trying to get at, knowing that we don't know which questions that we should be asking. So we wanted to take a very broad-based approach. And my goal was to do this as like Sociome as a Commons as a service. Bring your disease, bring your data, and we'll provide the platform for you to do the work. So we want to try to have scientists integrate large amounts of data into their research using hyperlocal information to identify novel risk factors and to try to understand different treatment efficacies, even things like epigenetic changes and how that interacts with the environment. These are just some different plots of data we've collected from around Chicago: evictions, noise levels, nitrogen dioxide, which is the way to map out the highways apparently, looking at lead indicators, which light up on the south side of Chicago, which is where the socioeconomic status tends to be much lower on the south and west sides. We've collected over 300 data sets now. These are mostly publicly curated data sets, and so we have a team that's taking them, figuring out the governance, trying to understand how to make them available in a single platform for researchers. We have a curation pipeline for how we bring in data sets and how we take data sets that people bring to us. We did a pilot using pediatric asthma because it's a huge priority at University of Chicago. We see persistent disparities across pediatric asthma incidence and morbidity and mortality. Again, if you look at the emergency department visits, they're much higher, of course, on the south side. University of Chicago is located upwards, as Woodlawn there. And the prevalence rates by race and ethnicity show a big gap, a big racial gap as well. We look at unique patients that University of Chicago sees by census tract, and then not surprisingly, most of our patients come from our neighborhoods. So that restricts the kind of research we can do. So we want to expand our work across our hospitals that we work with. And we're working with now all of these different medical centers, and we have a single cohort discovery tool, which allows us to discover patients across all these different centers now. What we found, of course, is that we have a disproportionate percent of asthma visits to University of Chicago than you would expect. We have 97% of our asthma visits are from the south side, which is not that surprising given our location, but that it's a huge gap that we have where we have a lot of kids coming to see us for asthma. We wrote a paper on this, was our first sociome paper, and found that things like the age of your building was important for discerning whether or not you had more asthma visits, or your susceptibility to flooding, which we think could be related to mold, but we're not sure yet. Violent crime rate was associated with poorer outcomes for kids with asthma. And then this was sent to me yesterday. It's the newest data. Apparently your tree cover, the amount of trees you have around you seems to be protective. Now, is that because nicer neighborhoods have more trees, or is it because of pollution? Is it because of noise? These are all things that we want to tease out. But the point is, we wanted to create a democratizable platform that would allow us to have anybody bring their disease and bring their data and allow us to geocode the patients and match it up against the sociome data. And that seems to be working. We've been approached by several other groups now that want to study their diseases, like lower extremity amputation, which has a huge racial gap in the south side of Chicago, pulmonary fibrosis, uterine cancer, head and neck cancer, and you name it. And to me, it's really about saying to the researcher, bring your data, bring your ideas, and we have the platform to help make that happen. And that seems to be working. And this is the kind of questions that we want to ask. So we had a meeting last week with urban planners because we want urban planning to help drive some of the work we do. If you change the way kids walk to school, can you reduce your percentage of asthma attacks? You know, if kids walk through an area that's not along the side of the highway, will that change things? These are the kinds of questions that we want to ask. If we reduce area violence, can we reduce spikes in blood pressure? Can we reduce obesity? These are the questions that we're hoping to ask. More information about our ITM and our sociome project is here. And I think that's about it. I want to, again, reinforce the point that there are a lot of groups out there that will take your data and put it into a data lake and try to make it available. We don't do that. We spend a lot of time and resources on the data dictionary, the model, the governance, building the community, because that's how you have a successful commons. It's not about collecting as much data as you can. It's not about data hoarding. It's about building a community that's invested in data literacy and wanting to build better data commons. This autonomy is really important. People need to feel like that their data, they have control over how it's used. And so we need to maintain that. And I didn't talk much about change management, but that's incredibly important, that when the data dictionary changes or the model changes, you have to tell people that researchers have to have confidence when they're using the data, that they understand how it's been updated and how it's been used. And then the governance and provenance, of course, is critical. If people don't have some confidence that you're contractually not going to use their data in the wrong way, they're not going to give it to you. This is our group right now. We're about 27, 28 people at UChicago. We have project managers, computer scientists. We have ontologists and data curators, communications, governance. We have people working on every aspect of this, and it's important to have this highly matrixed team to do the work. I want to make the point that most of our funding has come from foundations. The NIH and NCI are not great about giving you money to build platforms. They want to study disease. So we have some NIH funding. We have more NCI contracts to do data harmonization than we have grants. But these groups have been incredibly supportive in funding this kind of foundational work. And of course, we are very indebted to patients and families for giving us data and telling us how they want us to use their data. So I'll stop there. Left a lot of time for difficult questions, and hopefully we can have a discussion. So thanks.
Okay, I've got microphones for anyone with a question in the room. You can raise your hand. And while you think of your questions, I've got a couple of online questions from Clement Wilcox. For his first question, can you speak on the use of AI with this data, protecting PHI and improving speed?
Yeah, so we think, obviously, we have a lot of hope that different AI tools are going to change the way that we do this work. We're experimenting with large language models now for the interfaces for cohort discovery and for our clinical trials matching. So instead of going through a complicated form, you could actually say, you know, I have a child who's 12-year-old who has this, and it can actually give you an intelligent response. We think the cohort discovery tool is also going to be very amenable to using LLMs and other types of AI tools. A lot of folks are starting to use more AI methods for analysis. So we have a group, for instance, taking diagnostic radiology scans and the clinical data we have, putting it together and using image analysis to look for diagnostic predictors of survivorship. So I think the AI tools are very important. But as you know, to build good AI tools, you have to have really good, clean data. So by starting with good, clean data, we hope to really advance that. As far as privacy and security goes, so everything we do is de-identified. You can't discover any patient cells that are less than 5 people. Of course, we do have, you know, this is a separate soapbox, but de-identified does not mean non-re-identifiable. I think people confuse that. When you give somebody de-identified data, you have gone to some trouble to take out the HIPAA identifiers, but then they sign a contract that says, I promise not to try to re-identify these data, and I will only use it for the research I say I'm going to use it for. And that's a contract. So you have to trust researchers to not try to re-identify patients. We all could. I've been told that 3 consecutive hemoglobins is usually enough to identify somebody uniquely with an electronic health record. So it's not hard to re-identify somebody. What's important is that you contract to not try to do it. So we think privacy and security, of course, are very important. Parents and families want their data shared, but we want to make sure it's done securely. So all of our systems, of course, are HIPAA and GDPR compliant. But again, we rely on contracting to make sure people do the right thing.
Thanks. So a lot of misunderstandings about what constitutes PHI, what constitutes de-identified data, et cetera. How do you convince the holders of that what you're doing is correct? You know, I'll just give you an example. The state of Michigan, who we've gotten, you know, newborn dried blood spots, they will suppress data for small groups while also allowing me to genotype. And so, you know, in some cases, they suppress the sex of the child, and obviously that's readily discernible on genotyping. So there's a lot of misunderstanding by the data holders that I imagine you've bumped up against. So how do you educate them?
Yeah, so I think data literacy is a huge component here. And I think what you just described is a great opportunity to try to help people understand what it means, what PHI is, what PII is, what it means to have a HIPAA compliant platform, what it means to have safe harbor when you remove the HIPAA identifiers. All of our data, for instance, don't have dates, but we change everything to the age and days that the patient had the event or the scan or the biopsy. And I think a lot of it is education, but I think what I have noticed, maybe you've had this too, Logan, is that parents really want the data shared. The parents seem to be less worried than those around them, for what it's worth. But we go to great lengths to make sure that anybody we work with understands that, and you know, we go through security and privacy reviews anytime anybody asks for it and gives us data. We have a fully HIPAA compliant platform, and we've been so. Not really answering your question, but we go to great lengths to make sure that we've checked off all the boxes and that it's unassailable, that what we do is conforming to the privacy and security regulation of high tech. It's been harder with the Europeans because that we had to conform to things like right to forget and other things, but we were able to jump through all those hoops. So for us, it's more convincing through proving that we're conforming to all the different regulation. And then, you know, you could say, well, if you tell me somebody is a 16-year-old with osteosarcoma from Schaumburg diagnosed in 2020, that's not that many people, right? So we do have to be careful with, even once we de-identify things, that we're not inadvertently leading to some.
Allow geographic analyses down to the unit of Schaumburg.
We don't with our cohort, with our aggregate data, but you could request, we don't have this from the COG, but as we go forward, we're obviously going to get better geographic data, especially for the sociome work when we're going to geocode data. We're going to have to be very careful with the contracting that we put in place when we do those analyses.
Are there any other questions in the room? We have one more from Clement Wilcox on our virtual audience.
Lemon's our single source of online questions.
And he asks, how do you use community intelligence to learn more information? Those communities live every day with this and might know more information that is not getting collected in your data collection.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have built a whole community engagement core, and our community engagement core works with community groups, community centers, churches, and we convene community representatives and community groups to make sure that we are doing things in a way that hopefully respects what the community wants. The example I always use is, I might think it's great that we go put pollution sensors on top of every building in the neighborhood. Like that seems, of course, we'd want that. No, you can't just go do that. You have to like ask the community, is it okay with you and your community if we put pollution sensors in? Because you're making a very paternalistic judgment about what the community might or might not want. So this, I've never heard the term community intelligence used this way, but that makes a lot of sense, that you want to involve the community and have them be part of the decision-making process. We're just starting on a grant that's looking at the ethical framework and community engagement for building data commons and algorithms. And it's everything from how do you collect data, to how do you consent, to how do you use it, to how do you build ethical algorithms, to how do you deploy them in the community. That whole spectrum involves ethical frameworks and community involvement, and we need to ask the community every step of the way. That's why we started that lived experience advisory panel, because we want to get more parents and patients engaged in the work that we do.
Okay, we've got one more question from Rick Jansen. If the platform is soft funded, how do you go about ensuring the data remains accessible by patients in the long term?
Great question. Sustainability is always an important question. We have found that the biggest investment, of course, is in getting the platform started and getting it built. But for sustainability models, I think we're going to have to think about ways to so we have to be creative. So will investigators have to start using grant money to pay for data? We hope not. Will we start to monetize data with pharma companies? Will we use our data for external controls? These are all things that we've talked about. The community is not that excited, especially in pediatric oncology, about quote monetizing data. So we're doing a study now, going to families and asking them what they think about if their data are used for the development of drugs. The cancer community is a little bit unique here because we're working with the epilepsy community now, and they are trying so hard to get the data in the hands of pharma companies to develop drugs for these monogenic diseases. I think in the pediatric cancer community, we've been focused on trying to do our own studies and not necessarily make the data easily accessible to pharma, but I think that has to be on the table as something that at least we start to have discussions about. I think as far as longer term sustainability, I think we're seeing economies of scale as we build more and more of these data commons. It becomes cheaper and cheaper to operate each one. So I'm not that worried about the longer term sustainability of what we built. What I do worry about is how are we going to fund smaller and smaller groups to build their commons. We were talking this morning about building up PTLD, post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder data commons. That's going to be the smallest handful of patients with no funding. So how do you start to build those data commons? I think that's a harder question than sustainability, but they're both important.
All right, for a final question, we have Heidi Eschenbacher asks, how precise is the data geo-referenced? Address, zip code, county? Does it depend on the data set?
Yeah, so for the children's oncology group and other cooperative group data we have from around the world, it's really located at the country level. We may have smaller geographic distinctions, but we do not expose them in the aggregate. So for the most part, it's by country. What people wanted to avoid was the ability for somebody to come in and compare survivor rates between different cooperative groups very easily. So that's one of the things that we had to acquiesce to. As we do more of this sociome work, it's going to be more and more important to actually get geocoded address data. And so we are prepared to, in a HIPAA compliant and if necessary, FDA Part 11 compliant way to collect these data that are identified and make them available at a very granular way so that they can be matched up with environment data, pollution data, and things like that. So we have to be prepared for that. But right now, everything is much more high level by country. I can repeat it.
Here, let me bring a mic for you.
I want to be clear for the audience that when you talk about genetic data, usually you're talking about somatic genetic data, and you don't host any original like BAM files or anything like that. You get the calls that
Right.
Foundation Medicine or COG made, and then that's really not a question, but
No, but it's
confirm it.
So for pediatric cancer, we're mostly hosting genetic data, things like ALK mutation status and MYC amplification status. But for our epilepsy project now, we are going to be hosting either BAMs or VCF files, because if those data don't have a home, we want to give them a home. But we try to federate access wherever possible. So you can go in our platform, look up cancer patients and see exactly which patients have data in the Genomic Data Commons and bring up that search in the GDC and match those clinical and genomic data up together. But Logan is right. We mainly just have genetic findings, but I don't want to give the impression that we're not open to. We're open to any data type that doesn't have a home.
But you said you're now hosting BAMs for epilepsy. Do you make the BAMs available to people to use?
Again, that'll have to be, we haven't done this yet, but that'll have to be under the governance conditions from the groups that we collect them from. So for epilepsy, most of the data we're going to get are going to come from registries that have already collected the data that are saying we need a place to put these data. And so the governance model is going to be slightly different in that the individual registries are going to have a say in how the data are shared and used.
But say in the cancer predisposition cohort, you clearly they have germline, mutation status. The status is something that you would
for sure
collect,
and we would build that into the data dictionary. In fact, we just finished building out the ALK mutation status elements for neuroblastoma, which for some reason took a year and a half to do, but not easy. Good question. Yes. Should be on.
Thanks for this. This is great to hear about. I'm wondering, a lot of the data commons and other elements of your work are overlapping with the NCCR goals. Have you worked with them at all? And can you talk a little bit about how that collaboration might take shape?
Yeah, I worked with Lynn and others in NCCR, and I actually helped a little bit trying to understand their data dictionary models and how they were, when they did their supplement, understanding how they were collecting data for different cancer centers. My impression is that the data elements are not standardized as well as we would like to see them across. We tried to work with Lynn and her group to try to make sure they have access to the same standards we're using, which all go up through the enterprise vocabulary services at the NCI. And then the other project we're doing with, I don't know if this really counts as NCCR, but we're working with Lynn on doing some trans-Atlantic data sharing with groups in Europe on trying to share clinical and hopefully genomic data. But yeah, we've worked with, I'm trying to remember all their names, but mainly Lynn Penberthy and the others at NCCR, and we're part of their rare disease initiative. And our data dictionary folks try to work with them to make sure we're trying to use the same elements.
Any more questions? Let's see online. Great. With that, I think we can end a little bit early. Let's do one more round of applause for a great talk. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.